Good evening. I am Peter Bowman, the President of the World Affairs Council of New Hampshire. And I'd like to extend a very warm welcome to both our in-person and online audiences. This evening's event is provided or enabled by our sponsors and our event partners. Specifically, our sponsors are the World Affairs Council of America and the International Labor Organization, the ILO. Our event partners are the New Hampshire Businesses for Social Responsibility, the UNH Sustainability Institute, the Southern New Hampshire School of Business, and the UNH Paul School of Business. Our mission sponsor, I call it an existential sponsor, is the Southern New Hampshire University, without which we would have difficulty existing. For those unfamiliar with the World Affairs Council of New Hampshire, we are a nonprofit organization supported financially by membership, program fees, grants, donations, sponsorships from both individuals and businesses. If not already a member or a donor, we strongly encourage you to become one or both of those and joining us in our venture. Talk with any of our staff or board members, or you can go to the website wacnh.org to find out how to be a partner with us. We're a platform for discussion and take no positions on policies, politics, parties, or candidates. The views expressed this evening are the speakers and not ours. We have fostered learning, discussion, and involvement in the world affairs, interfacing with the state for 70 years, or nearly 70 years. It started in 1954, which is quite a long time ago, not quite as old as I am, but approaching it. We help create and sustain international connections that enhance our state's cultural, economic, and civic life. We help build global knowledge and understanding through our educational programs and work with communities and schools on this subject. We help develop international leaders in partnership with the U.S. Department of State. And finally, we firmly believe that an informed public is one of the bedrock principles of a working democracy. I will now introduce this evening's speaker. Kevin Cassidy is Director and Representative to the Bretton Woods and Multilateral organizations at the International Labor Organization, or ILO. His talk will center on how corporations, workers, and governments can come together to ensure success for both businesses and communities. And I really laud this. I may be naive, but I have worked through much of my life to achieve similar things, but in an informal way. Leaning on the successes of the ILO's tripartite structure, which is government, workers, and business leaders, he will provide key insights into how these diverse groups can come together to build a positive relationship and enhance their operability. Prior to his appointment as director at the ILO, he served as a senior communications, economic, and social affairs officer at the ILO, located at the United Nations, and he also worked extensively for that organization, the UN. Mr. Cassidy holds a Master's of Economics and Political Development degree from Columbia University School of International and Public Affairs. I'm going to tell them what the title of your talk is, and I had to look up some of these terms. It's from CSR to ESG, and in case you were asking what CSR is, you'll know by the end of the talk, but it's corporate social responsibility, and ESG stands for environment, social, and governance. So it's from CSR to ESG, ensuring success for companies and communities. Kevin Cassidy. Thank you, sir.
Thank you, Peter. And to those here and those watching far, thank you for the invitation to be here today. I'd like to just start very quickly. The International Labour Organization is a technical agency of the United Nations. There are 36 agencies and funds and programs that make up the UN system. The ILO is one of the oldest. It was created actually out of the Treaty of Versailles in 1919 alongside the League of Nations and the International Court of Justice. Sometimes it takes these big conflagrations to create these big international institutions because we realize that global problems need global institutions. The ILO has this tripartite nature. It brings together the workers, employers, and governments to discuss these issues. And it is the actors of the real economy, workers and employers, sitting at the table who negotiate what the rules of the road for the capitalist economy will be. Because those who may remember in their economic histories that capitalism in 1919 is one of many competing models. So at the beginning, the ILO has a normative role, which means that we help set the international labor standards. It's not the technicians or bureaucrats in the ILO, but it is the governments, the 187 governments, plus the workers and business organizations in those countries. So it is not unusual to have Coca-Cola or Disney or Walmart sitting at the table in Geneva discussing these issues. I'm not here to advise. I'm here to give you an overview of the work that we do, what we see happening, some of the latest developments. Some of you may agree, some may not, but I think the important thing is it is a conversation about how the world of work is changing. COVID-19 has really brought that to the fore for many of us, and I think this discussion about the performance of companies is one part of the equation. There are many other aspects to this which we'll look at. And also to say that companies that are practicing CSR, this is not a call for them to change. Some companies are doing excellent work on this subject matter. The environmental, social, and governance structures are giving greater specificity because not all companies saw CSR in the same way. Some just linked it to philanthropy. And we're moving now from ESG, which of course is in the discussion, but towards what's called the SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals, which give even greater levels of specificity. So with that brief overview, I'm going to just give some broad terms. So CSR largely is a self-regulating business model where companies who are more conscious of the impact that they have on wider society and encouraging those businesses to actively operate in ways that make themselves more accountable to the stakeholders and to the public. ESG is basically the criteria that sets standards, largely for potential investors to screen companies that they would potentially invest in. In ESG standards, companies are looking at environmental footprints, their impact, relationships in the areas in which they operate in, including employees, suppliers, customers, and wider community. And companies' leadership, executive pay, shareholder rights, audits, internal controls. Largely, just to let you know, ESG was a phrase that was coined at the UN, on the UN's Principles for Responsible Investment, which came out in 2006. I wanted to introduce a bit of the Sustainable Development Goals. I don't know how much that sort of terminology echoes beyond the walls of the UN system, but we are, as an international organization and in a system of organizations, Sustainable Development Goals are really a call to action. It is to end poverty, protect the planet, improve the lives and the prospects of everyone, everywhere. There are 17 goals, which are broken down into 169 targets, which covers everything from health, education, clean energy, what we call decent work, reducing inequality, sustainable cities, climate action, partnerships, and these were adopted by the UN's member states in 2015 as a part of the 2030 Sustainable Development Agenda. We are well underway. We are unfortunately not on target where we should be with that. The progress has been uneven, and we are not really advancing at the scale that we require that. And for example, climate change action is one obvious example of that. So where are we? So CEOs have responded to all sorts of problems, the worsening of the climate change, the widening inequalities, soaring healthcare costs, by promising that their corporations will lead the way and provide solutions that are seen as socially responsible. The general assessment from the labor and human rights professionals is that CEOs won't do anything that's going to harm their bottom lines. and that businesses are in the job of making money and for their shareholders and for themselves. They believe, at least in the rights-based approach, that the real social change may in fact actually prevent CEOs from doing many of the hugely profitable things they're doing today. And they won't change unless they are required by law. Now, we have a more nuanced view because we speak with and we work very much alongside businesses. We do see that companies are understanding this. And one of the areas that is actually coming into focus as well is that a lot of the younger people today want to admire the companies they work for. They want to be able to appreciate the company's value, so they see themselves in that, and not necessarily for the long haul, because for young people today, you'll probably have about 10 different jobs in 6 different careers. That's the way the job markets are going. But just focusing down on this, the increase in stakeholder, and I use the word stakeholder as compared to shareholder, because people who work for companies are stakeholders. The communities in which the companies are in are stakeholders. The country itself is a stakeholder in how the performance of that company is doing and how it's providing for the citizens in various areas. So the scrutiny on sustainability practices is driven by investors, society at large wanting businesses to align their values to respond to issues such as climate change or the impact of COVID-19. What we found out with COVID-19 is that an unhealthy workplace makes it an economically disastrous workplace. The global economy had basically shut down when COVID had kicked into gear. I think it was the mid of March in 2020 when we see this happening. And from the ILO estimates in the first 6 months, we saw about 257 million jobs, or the equivalent of 257 million jobs being basically wiped off the map. And that happened with just a small pathogen entering into the workplace. So companies are feeling the challenges, and they're trying to link their commitments to long-term value. And leveraging the appropriate long-term value creation metrics is going to be really important. So I think that's where CSR migrating into ESG. ESG provides a more or a greater level of specificity on how companies should be measuring themselves. Now, how did this all start? In the 1970s, there were frameworks that are starting to evolve internationally, looking at ethical behavior of multinational enterprises, this social contract as it was called. And there were 3 main instruments that are aligned and that complement each other that have become key reference points in how companies can act responsibly. The first international instrument, is the ILO's tripartite declaration on principles and concerning multinational enterprises and social policy. This is what we call the M&E Declaration. This was developed in 1977 and was updated in 2017. And it provides a clear guidance on how enterprises should contribute through their operations to international labor standards and the realization of decent work. Maybe just to explain what we mean by decent work. It's not just a good job. Decent work is about a job that is freely chosen, that offers an opportunity for advancement, a fair remuneration, and the ability to see yourself working for that company for a longer period of time. When people feel that the companies look after them individually, people tend to stay with that company, they're more loyal to that company, and they will be good ambassadors for that company, and they're more productive. So we do see values in companies valuing their employees and looking after issues that are important to individuals as well. So the M&E Declaration is rooted in international labor standards, as you could imagine, and it's highlighting the role of government in stimulating good corporate behavior, as well as a crucial role for social dialogue. We use the word social a lot. Basically, it means people to people. Social dialogue is any communication between workers and employers that help address the issues before they become problems in the workplace. It is not in the interest of workers to go out on strike. It is not in the interest for companies not to have good workers who are aligned to their corporate values. We want to make sure that people are communicating with one another, and that is the core of the ILO's mandate, is to create dialogue. The second international instrument that looks at this is the Organization of Economic Cooperation and Development, OECD, which is out of Europe. Their guidelines for multinational enterprises. They also cover all areas of business responsibility, labor and human rights, environmental issues, disclosure, bribery, consumer interests, science and technology, competition, and taxation. The third element, instrument is the United Nations Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights. These, what they're called UNGPs for short, came about in 2011, and it's an instrument consisting of 31 principles on the issues of human rights and what we would call transnational corporations and other business enterprises. These guiding principles provide global standards addressing the risk and adverse impacts on human rights to both the business activity and to society at large. For those who are interested, the UN guiding principles, if you look at principle 12, it states that responsible business enterprises to respect human rights refers internationally to recognize human rights, which is understood at a minimum of the International Bill of Human Rights and principles concerning fundamental rights that are outlined in the ILO's Declaration on Fundamental Principles and Rights at Work. The ILO's Declaration on Fundamental Principles and Rights at Work have 5 categories. The first one is no child labor. I think we can agree that child labor is something that could be a blight on society, but child labor happens because of poverty. Many families will need to put food on the table, school may not be available, or the quality is very poor, or the family may have to pitch in order to put enough food on the table for everyone. So, but no child labor, because a child who is illiterate enumerate will grow up to be illiterate enumerate and cannot contribute fully to society. So investing in children is absolutely important for all economies around the world. It's not always possible. There is flexibility to allow some light work for children, but if children are in the factory or in the workplace, they are not able to bring their skills, their talents to full fruition. The second element of the fundamental principles and right is no forced labor. The ILO has a number of international conventions that underpin this. It is just to say that this is a form of modern slavery. Forced labor are people who are in work. They could be paid for the work, but if they are there involuntarily, they are forced to labor. We had that, a modern example is in Uzbekistan. We were working with the World Bank and the US government and the Swiss government. In Uzbekistan, cotton is a harvest in Uzbekistan, which generates most of its export earnings. And they emptied out the barracks, the schools, the hospitals, and everybody went to the field to pick cotton. And that was a mobilization of 2.4 million people. But because the bank and the US government and the European Union have laws against forced labor, those goods could not go into the markets. So the economy was suffering. There was a political changeover, which was really the trigger that made this all happen, but it was civil society, it was media, it was the government, it was the bank and others that helped us go in 7 years from 2.3 million forced laborers and child laborers down to less than 1,000. Now, this takes a lot of work, but it is very important that it does happen, it can happen, and it's a recent example of what forced labor is, and that it is not necessary, because if you are competing on forced labor, you're never going to be able to integrate into the global economy. Some of the other issues that were on the fundamental rights is no discrimination in respect to employment, so that could be race, gender, ethnicity, political position. There are many different forms of discrimination. Occupational safety and health is now a fundamental right, and I think COVID-19 had brought that to the fore for us. And then the last issue is freedom of association and collective bargaining. I leave that for the end because for a lot of people that's the contentious issue. What that basically means is that people have the right to join others to protect their rights in the workplace. Businesses do this through chambers of commerce, through professional associations, and workers do this largely through trade unions or workers' organizations. You're at a disempowered or a asymmetrical power relationship, and you want to ensure that you are getting a fair wage for your work. It also helps for the business as well. No one wants to negotiate with 2,000 workers in the workplace. If you have representatives who are representing you and ensuring that you are fairly paid for your work, that is, again, something that the ILO pushes forward on. So those are on the labor rights. There are the Rio Summit, those who may know the start of that. This was in 1992, so most of the environmental movement came out of that. Today we have the COP25, COP26. This is the Conference of Parties that have signed on to the climate change framework. That is coming into the equations for ESG. And then, as I said, increasingly now large enterprises are using the Sustainable Development Goals of the UN. ESG is largely for investment in stocks and funds. And people are starting to look at the ESG scores to avoid investing in companies that they don't feel that align with their beliefs or their their feeling about how businesses should be done. And ESG investing is driven, I think, largely by the bottom line. As I said, companies are in the business to make money, to create opportunities for themselves, which is great. The International Labor Organization is not anti-business. Actually, we celebrate business. If there are no companies out there, there are no jobs. But companies also need talent pipelines. They need good people to work for them. And again, we need to have that dialogue. ESG is most like social responsible investing. It screens out publicly traded companies and industries that do not meet value criteria. Investments in this need to have a positive impact on the ways in which the business organization accomplish these goals and seeks financial and social performance concurrently. So impact investing is a very important part of this change, and it is also becoming embedded in regulation. So legislation requires most jurisdictions of listed companies to disclose their ESG footprint in the form of these ESG disclosure reports. National jurisdictions will usually propose a common set of ESG metrics, reporting for all those listed companies. Unfortunately, this is not the same across the world. This is the importance of developing standards. I mean, we develop standards all the time in the ILO, but standards are impacting on your life. Yellow paint in the street, traffic lights, these are standards. ATM machines, you go up to a machine and you put your card in, you put a couple of numbers, and you could be standing in Tashkent, or you could be in Beijing, or you could be down in Lilongwe, and you hope that your money gets transferred from your dollars to the local currency because of standards. And that took 2 banks and 3 satellites to complete. So standards are very important for a functioning society. And the regulations that are there and proposing these metrics are, as I said, mostly correlating to financial performance. And the most commonly sought metrics are the following: the presence of an overarching ESG policy, that companies have committed to a policy, assignment of that ESG management responsibility. It's no good to say we are committed without having someone in the structure of the company who is charged with following up on that. Developing a corporate code of ethics. I think most companies today will have a code of ethics. I've even been asked recently to comment on a big company's human rights policy. So this language of rights are permeating into the business community. In addition to that, the ESG metrics will include presence of litigation. I think for companies, you face uncertainty, legal uncertainty in different countries around the world. The model today are international buyers going to local suppliers. How do you know that cotton that may have been used or harvested by children or harvested by forced labor, that enters into your supply chain? In the US, for those who may know, that under the Department of Homeland Security, there is a group called the Customs and Border Protection. They have a withhold and release order. So for example, cotton coming in from Xinjiang in China, there's a well-founded fear that the Uyghurs have been used to harvest that cotton, and hence those goods that come into the US market sit on the dock. So increasingly, countries are putting regulations in place to ensure that you are doing the right thing as a corporate citizen. And if you are in litigation for that, the investors will look at that with a second glance and maybe not investing. It also includes the diversity and inclusion in your workplace, environmental policy, your carbon footprint, data and cybersecurity instances, health and safety events. So these disclosures on these ESG factors are becoming more standardized. That's why I was saying before that, don't stop the CSR, but let us be more fine-tuned about it. Let's have a common understanding so that we could measure apples and apples instead of looking at different elements on that. The ILO itself, as I said, has an international jurisdiction on labor standards, and most of the ESG disclosures, practically every company that is responding to that is actually referencing the ILO standards. So I don't know how many people here even have heard of the ILO before I stood up here today, but we're the best kept secret in the UN system. Because we work at that unique intersection of the economic and the social. Work is something that defines us. Work is something that helps us provide for our families. It keeps us connected and rooted in reality, and also to the updates in society and to be able to meet new people. So work is a really unique entry point for for dealing with social and economic issues. Now, international labor standards are instruments designed for national governments. When the international standards, our recent standard, Convention 190, is on violence and harassment at work. Violence and harassment in workplace is one of the major challenges and barriers to women going back into the workforce. And moving forward into the future of work, we need higher labor force participation of women. But challenges like violence and harassment, these are up to countries to ratify. Once they ratify the convention, they create national legislation which guides the society and businesses operating in that society about what is acceptable and what isn't. So the work of the ILO is not to monitor or to police companies. That is not our job. That is the job of the governments themselves, of labor inspectorates, and it is for the industry themselves. I think many companies today want to do the right thing. They want to ensure that people feel comfortable buying their goods and services. Forced labor and child labor comes everywhere in the world. It's not everywhere all the time, but it is in every country. So when we look at these issues, we have to make sure that there are laws in place, that labor inspectorates can do their job. We build capacity in developing countries and emerging economies to make sure that they can respond to this so that everyone is on a level playing field. Because if people are using child labor or forced labor, which is not really productive, but they could be at a cost competitive advantage, and that puts this unlevel playing field where other countries may be losing out. EFG scores may not reflect the internal reality. Sometimes the ESG positions are not also properly understood by stakeholders. So there's a lot of subjectivity in this at the moment, and the lack of reporting standards on universally accepted criteria has created problems for the rating agencies. Some of the standards that are out there right now, the more common frameworks, are the Global Reporting Initiative standards. This is most widely used when companies are reporting on ESG. Internationally Integrated Reporting Council, the SASB, the UN Global Compact, Climate Disclosure Boards. It is a bit of a mixed bag at the moment, and I think this is what I talk about, the transition. So maybe right now just to focus a little bit on the benefits of ESG. So ESG factors have been found to positively correlate with financial performance and attractiveness to investors. So the link between ESG strategy and the cost of capital, investors are increasingly focusing on and understanding a company's ability to manage long-term risks through ESG disclosures. That's what it is bringing to the fore. And why is it important? Because if you are putting money into a pension, your pension fund is investing in these countries, in these companies. And if these companies have certain risks, whether it be legal uncertainty or not understanding the rules of or laws of particular countries, they have exposure. And those companies could actually be put at a disadvantage or out of business. What we're finding right now, and there are a number of studies on this, to say that 88% of companies that have been studied, Oxford University had a recent study, that solid ESG practices resulted in better operational performance. So ESG is not just about investing, it's also about improving efficiency of the operation itself. And that 80% of those companies saw stock price performance positively influenced by good sustainability practices. So there is a correlation between ESG, good performance, keeping employees, and also the performance of that company itself. Consumers are displaying increased loyalty and affiliation to brands that demonstrate a clear commitment to the purpose of ESG principles. And if you're able to leverage these long-term evaluation metrics such as accountability, sustainability value, business transformation, transparency, businesses can better demonstrate their contribution towards sustainable long-term value creation and a full ESG strategy development process from vision definition to implementation. I just wanted to talk a little bit here in the conclusion part of this about the benefits of taking ESG seriously. Accessing supply chains. Companies with large or distributed supply chains use social compliance auditing to document suppliers' adherence to social compliance guidelines. And these are largely based on ILO principles. Now that you know the ILO exists, you'll start to notice the the ILO footprint in there. Some large brands have custom software that can track suppliers and vendors and facilities and reports and alerts indicating where audits are required. I know for many businesses, audits can be very cumbersome. But if the businesses themselves are putting in practices, procedures, and using technology to alert the management to problems before they become a problem to the public, they can self-correct. And I think ESG is helping do that. If businesses want to access commercial opportunities afforded by global supply chains, they need to be proactive in providing these companies with ESG assurances. Triple bottom line and positive branding. Consumers and investors are better informed than ever, and this is being driven in large part by demographic changes, as I mentioned, and social attitudes. Younger people are demanding more of companies for them to be good corporate citizens or to be able to affect positively the world around them. And this increasing demand that enterprises take a more ethical approach and how they source raw materials and the enterprise's stance on social and economic and environmental issues. The speed of reputational damage today is instantaneous. When companies are in fact involved in bad business practices, whether it is the internet, whether it is word of mouth, whether it is legislative, whether it is through media in other forms, that shortens the timeline from problem to massive protection mode. I mean, companies don't want to have businesses shut down or don't want to have too much, shall we say, intervention by governments. Let the business get on with their business, but they have to be focused on the right thing. Also, businesses can access commercial opportunities. Achieving the global goals, the SDGs I talked about, opens up a $12 trillion market of opportunities in 4 economic systems examined by the UN's Business and Sustainability Commission. These are food and agriculture, cities, energy and materials, and health and well-being. This is 60% of the real economy. So this is not just, do well because doing well, makes people feel good, but it actually helps the bottom line. So these commercial opportunities are really pushing companies to respond to the ESG criteria. Another benefit is accessing government tenders. Price is no longer a key factor in determining public purchases choices. Many governments and even large universities are using procurement policy to make sure that the companies that they are spending their money on are actually putting in place environmental, social, and governance guidelines. And this helps provide best value for money approach. So it's not lowest cost, it is the best value. And I think we see that across the globe in the work that we're doing. So public procurement decisions will shift to this multi-criteria approach, and these various dimensions of the environment and the social are really being expressly required in procurement specifications. Governments may also incentivize engagement. So in many countries, the engagement of the private sector in the sustainable development goals and the implementation is part of official policies. Governments by themselves cannot achieve these 17 goals. This is eliminating poverty, it's eliminating hunger, it's providing for education, addressing inequalities, decent work and full employment, protecting the environment above land, above sea, below sea, what you would call the blue economy or the green economy. These goals are the job of the entire society, and it manifests itself through business operations. So businesses have a really important part, and governments can provide tax breaks, they can provide technology, a leasing or licensing of technology. They could also help find new markets. I mean, this is largely where chambers of commerce come into play and engaging with the US government and its trade representative. The ILO works very closely with the US Trade Representative's Office, for example, with the trade agreement, USMCA. The ILO has been asked to help out in looking at factories that are not following the letter of the trade agreement through what's called the rapid response mechanism, which is a factory level response. And that is actually keeping companies on their toes, because if companies are underpaying workers or saying in public we're paying them a certain amount and then the workers' paycheck do not reflect that, or they don't have the benefits that have been promised to them, which will then put the American auto manufacturers at a level playing field, it will negatively affect unemployment opportunities here. So everyone has to know what the rules of the road are, and once that is clear and is put forward, I think we find that things work better. Sustainability by trends. So this is happening in fossil fuels, and that is also helping with the transition to a low carbon economy, which I think many people who are sensitive to the environment will realize that it is absolutely important to go from high carbon to low carbon. The sustainable energy sector is thriving with solar PV, in wave form, biomass, geothermal, wind. All of these are creating opportunities. They will displace workers as well too, but we're seeing that working alongside good corporate behavior and the transition to these sustainability goals are mutually supportive to one another. We look at the sustainable energy sector, that it can create a net positive of 80 million jobs worldwide. And these are good paying jobs because they're higher level jobs. Other areas for sustainability is in mining. There is a responsible mining foundation that looks at due diligence systems. Financial services, people are looking at the risks there. Looking at issues such as modern slavery, human trafficking. When you look at finances and seeing finances moving around the world, you can see if companies are involved in this practice. And that's another discussion which we hopefully will have one day. Agriculture, looking at the risk to workers, forced labor, child labor, low wages, poor health and safety, physical abuse, but also exposure to high heat. Occupational safety and health, as I mentioned, is a fundamental right for the ILO. Those who are in the medical field will know that renal failure, people who are working in agriculture, they're going to have kidney failure, and it obviously impacts directly upon that individual and the community from which they come. So we need to look more at occupational safety and health. Other sectors are tourism, manufacturing, infrastructure, construction, and real estate. So just to close here to say that we believe that businesses are the engine of the economy. They contribute to the economic and social development through job creation, through development of skills and technology, and the provision of jobs and of goods and services. At the same time, business activities can have an adverse impact on people, environment, and society. The Sustainable Development Goals looked at the 3 Ps: people, planet, and prosperity. That's what we're looking for in Sustainable Development Goals. So what are we taking away from this? We're realizing that the expectations of good conduct go beyond broad legal requirements and can enhance a company's performance, and can have a positive impact on the business operations by managing risks and more efficiently, and encourage corporate reputation. So I'll stop there and we'll open up for a Q&A. Thank you.
Well, good evening, everyone. Do you want me to use the mic? Let's sit down, Kevin, just so we can kind of chat with people. I'm Michelle Beasy. I'm the Executive Director of New Hampshire Businesses.
Thank you, Ken, for social responsibility. And so I was very excited to hear you talk about the ILO using the lens of really understanding that most businesses do want to try be positive players. We certainly believe that business can be a force for good, but of course there are bad players in every segment of our society, and we have to recognize that. So I'm wondering, just my own question before I turn it over to the audience, I'm kind of wondering with supply chains, you are involved with so many countries around the world. When we as consumers or businesses looking at their supply chain, how does the ILO come into play when we're thinking about all of these issues that you've called out for us? How do you kind of, I wouldn't say police that, but how do you track?
Right. So I mean, it's something that is very much on the front agenda of the ILO. We stay away from the word global supply chains. We call them supply chains, I think, in many ways, because a lot of the way in which the structure of supply chains have developed over the years is that you have large international buyers that are going to a single vendor to look at them doing everything. And we'll use China, for example. Companies have been investing in China for the last 50, 60 years. China has pulled 100 million people out of poverty by creating this workshop, this manufacturing hub for the world. And as such, they are looking at the harvesting or the mining of raw commodities that will create the inputs to develop the parts that are assembled and then packaged and then shipped around the world. So in that supply chain, and most international companies don't have visibility beyond the first or second tier, sometimes not even beyond the first tier. But I think COVID-19 had shown that we became very vulnerable in this. And the activities that businesses undertake, such as just-in-time delivery, warehousing, direct to retail, it cut out a lot of the steps in between. But then when COVID struck and we couldn't get those supplies in, everybody suffered. There are a lot of these hollow cars that are being made because every car today has a chip in it with firmware embedded in that for the technology that's there. And we couldn't get those chips because a lot of the car manufacturers thought there was always going to be an infinite supply. The bigger supplier of that is in Taiwan. And we're now having geopolitical issues with China over to Taiwan. So what does the ILO do? So it is a political issue that needs to be looked at. And it's also an economic and a social issue. So the ILO has a very big research department, a big statistical department, a big legal department globally. So we look at these issues and see where the problems are arising. We sit down with the workers and employers and we talk to them about the challenges they face. So the ILO is looking at the various aspects and where the problem points are, how we address that, and it's being very sensitive to the actors of the real economy. It's not for the ILO as a technical agency to tell a company, your supply chain is all wrong. I mean, they're the ones working on it. We want to ensure that we protect people in supply chains, not the jobs themselves. So we take a legal point of view about what's happening in those countries and are they following the rules? Are they putting, forced labor cotton or cobalt that is mined by child laborers in the DRC or going into our laptops, into our phones? We have to look at all those issues because it's not just about the developed countries which gets the end product, right? We're in a knowledge economy here, or an innovation economy more accurately, but many countries around the world are stuck in agriculture, subsistence farming, or harvesting raw materials and exporting those raw materials. And abuses happen all along those supply chains. But now, because the space is being constrained by due diligence laws in the EU, by the withhold and release orders in the United States, there are a number of other countries that are putting these laws in place, which means that you have to make sure that you know where all those products are coming from. So we do a lot of research, we do a lot of surveys, we work with experts on this, we sit down and talk. I mean, if you think having discussions amongst like-minded people can be difficult sometimes. Try to sit down with 187 countries with the workers and employers, and you get 7,000 different responses to that. So it's a very long and slow process, but we do look at the human component in that because we want the economy to move forward. But we also want to make sure that businesses are protected, because if you shut down a business, like for example with Uzbek cotton, the consortium of NGOs had convinced over 215 American companies not to invest in Uzbekistan. So Uzbekistan could not export the only crop that actually earned them money. Their only market today is in Russia. Now with the financial controls in Russia, they're only getting paid in rubles, and rubles are useless in Uzbekistan. They have also 1 million workers coming back in from Russia because they were migrant workers earning pay, remitting that back to their families, and so now that's gone away. So now you have a situation in this supply chain that had been shut down because child and forced labor was being used in the cotton, one aspect of a textile supply chain. It's destroying the company unless companies go back and invest. And there are difficulties. It's a landlocked country. It doesn't have access to ports. There are increased transportation costs. It's in a very delicate part of the world in Central Asia along the Silk Road, where there's a lot of competition with China, which is building its Yidayulu, the One Belt, One Road initiative there to build strategic outposts for itself. So it's a very complex problem, but we want to make sure that businesses are safe, that people are protected, and that the global economy continues. Because we are, whether we like it or not, embedded so much in hyper-globalization today that we cannot produce these products here in the US.
Interesting, awesome. I'm wondering if everyone here tonight has questions they'd like to ask of Kevin as well.
Actually, the ILO doesn't do any work in the US. I mean, we're a knowledge organization. We have experience over 100 years of policies in the world of work, and we understand what works in certain social and economic environments. The US is a big supporter of the ILO. The ILO was created in 1919, and the US didn't join, I think, until 1936 under FDR. But the US was very much involved in the beginning of international organizations. Right? I mean, part of my title is Bretton Woods, which is a ski resort, I think, north of here, where the financial architecture after World War II was created. So all of these international organizations were created. And by the way, your former governor, John Gilbert Wynett, was the Director General of the ILO in 1939 to 1941. So New Hampshire has a special place in my heart today as well. But we don't do work in the US. We work with policymakers. We work with development agencies like the US Agency for International Development. We work with State Department. We work with the Trade Department, the US Trade Representative's Office, a number of other agencies in the US. We share information. We share statistics. But most of the work that the ILO does is in developing countries and in emerging economies. But we have a convening power that brings all these countries together to discuss the issues, because you never know where a good idea can come from. We're finding that in environmental issues, right? Indigenous populations in the Amazon or in Africa have really good ways of using water very effectively. We are looking at different countries around the world about how they're responding to labor force development issues, right? So we have that knowledge base and we share that knowledge base. The US has been very generous to assist us on addressing problems. So for example, those who may remember Senator Harkin, there was the Harkin-Engel Protocol on limiting child labor. And because of that, there was a funding channel that the US government made available to the ILO, and we worked globally on eliminating child labor. And from 2000 to I would say 2019, we reduced child labor with global action, with the funding provided generously by the US government. We reduced child labor by 100 million. That was almost 1/3 of child labor removed. And that meant the children who would normally be out working and slaving in the fields and doing this dangerous and dull and dirty work, they were getting an education. They were becoming the leaders in their society. So you want kids in school because that's going to help that country economically and socially grow. So the ILO doesn't do work in the US. What I'm here about, and the reason that I'm sitting on this stage, is that the World Affairs Council and my office have been working together on a little bit of a listening tour, hearing how people experience the world of work. What are the challenges that you're experiencing here? I was just in Denver at the National Resources Energy Lab. Amazing work going on, great ideas. I was in Covington, Kentucky, talking to the government officials there about the work that they're doing on sustainability and looking at the ecological situation. And just from my experience in the UN, I had asked the 4 government officials, have you met before today? And they said, no. I mean, I know she works down the hall and he's over here, but we've never talked to each other. So you're working on economic development, you're working on resources, you're working on wastewater treatment plants. Maybe you can share some ideas. Oh, and by the way, here are your counterparts in Denver. Here are your counterparts in Salt Lake City, in New Mexico, in New York. So for me, from the outside, I'm just seeing the techniques we use on sharing knowledge, sharing experiences, and being able to hear and experience these issues. I myself, I grew up in a small town, New York City, and with that, I have a very different perspective of the world. I've spent more time and I've been in more countries than there are states in the US, and I figured it was incumbent upon me as an official of an international organization to connect with people, to see how they're viewing the world of work, the challenges they face in the world of work, and what research the ILO is developing, or what policies other countries have done, which can actually help at the country, county, state, or federal level. So I'm out here to hear the challenges and to provide possibly access to information and to other counterparts internationally, maybe even nationally as well, too. Without a police in the United States.
We do have some questions in the chat, and there's 2 questions that are very similar from Dorothy in Concord and John in Tempe. And basically the gist of the questions are, it seems like ESG is still very unclear in terms of what accountability looks like. Can you talk a little bit more about what is happening and where things need to get so that people can better understand these companies and whether or not they're actually adhering to these standards?
Right. So there are a number of standard agencies out there. They're not, shall we say, internationally recognized standards organizations. For us at the UN system, maybe we believe in multilateralism, but when there are national institutions that are created and they are called international, it doesn't necessarily mean that they are recognized by the international community. But there are a number of groups out there that are looking at this. I'm not going to be able to give chapter and verse, Tim. I think we're going to have to put it in the follow-up to this on your website. But for example, the GRI, Global Reporting Initiative, which came out of the UN, this is now looking at ESG. Yes, ESG is still a bit amorphous, but it is narrowing down and agreeing on what are the metrics that you should be looking at. And again, some companies have taken CSR and ran 100% with it. They were not just looking at doing philanthropic activities or doing something for a marketing ploy. Some companies took this as a serious opportunity to change the way in which they do business, how they engage with society, how they engage with other businesses, and I applaud them for that. And CSR now has had, I don't know, it's about 30 years that CSR has been in, even from the 70s, as I said in the earlier history, the first standards about this had started way back when. So it's still in its infancy. ESG gives more definition to that, but companies haven't all brought that on board yet, and it's not required by law. And as I said, ESG does embed a lot of the ILO standards in it, but ILO is at the national level, not at the corporate level. Corporates have different parameters that they have to pay attention to, shareholder value as compared to stakeholder value. Hopefully they see society writ large, even the environment as a stakeholder for them. The reason I also introduced the Sustainable Development Goals, and anyone who has a chance to look at it, please go to the UN site, look at SDGs, that's what they're called, Sustainable Development Goals 2030. And the 17 goals and 164 targets are very specific targets for the world community to achieve about drinking water, about gender-responsive policies in the world of work, about the treatment of biodiversity, about how to end hunger, about how to address inequalities. So there are very prescriptive targets and lots of information about how to do that. So when we migrate from CSR to ESG to SDG, and we have greater specificity, then we are really measuring apples for apples. Because some companies may say, yeah, we're doing this, and that's our perception of how we're doing. But who is actually ensuring that that perception actually meets the reality? Again, that's not the role of the ILO. It may not even be the role of the chambers of commerce. Maybe government has to mandate it. I know there's a fierce independence in New Hampshire, so I won't talk about regulations, because I know I've been heard earlier that you have a, what is it, it's not the Senate, but the House, which you have 400 members, and it has people of all. That's right, the longest in the world of continually meeting in the same space. So I took a little knowledge away from my stay here in New Hampshire. But it is moving in that direction, and I think it's going to get better because companies are being constrained. They can't use child labor, forced labor in their supply chains. They cannot just use low cost as a comparative advantage. These directives that are coming out of the EU and the US, these are the largest markets in the world. So if companies want to do business in these markets, they're going to have to ensure that they're not falling afoul of those prescriptions.
I think it really puts everyone on an equal playing field, right? So that,
Absolutely.
As we have these standards, then, things like the Securities and Exchange Commission is now putting out standards for reporting, carbon reporting, basically, to make sure that companies are not in this greenwashing area, that they're really, measuring the same thing and that they're fully disclosing what their risks might be once they're impacted by various climate events. So it definitely brings more kind of leveling everybody out. So I think the companies that have been trying to do good are probably welcoming all of these changes. So.
And we do help them in our work. For example, we have a program globally which is called Better Work. And Better Work is working at the factory level around the world in factories that major US companies are using. So it's in Vietnam, it's in Indonesia, it's in Egypt, we're starting one in Uzbekistan to help attract investment back to that country because they've done the right thing politically, but now they need investment in those countries. Otherwise, millions of people fall into poverty. Right? So this Better Work program, it's not just about doing good in the workplace, but it's about productivity, profitability, access to markets. Right? So it helps companies understand there is a correlation to being a good actor in this space and accessing these markets, which at the end of the day, that's what shareholders want, that's what companies want, I think that's what the public wants.
So does the ILO have a scorecard for countries?
The ILO works at a regional level. As you can imagine, I mean, the World Bank doesn't care. They just give out standards on each one of the countries themselves. The ILO is a bit more nuanced. No country wants to be on the naughty list, right? So pointing fingers we don't find really works very well. So we have the international statistics. We do massive surveys around the world. On our latest estimates on modern slavery, which is forced labor and forced marriage, we work with Gallup. They know what they're doing. They do very good polls. So we worked with them in 68 national polls. So we are working in getting that information. Do we have it in our microdata or our meta? Yeah, we do. But we put it out in regional. So we're looking at regional comparisons on that. And then when you are meeting in the ILO for your conference, you get to meet the other delegates. You get to compare with one another on that. So we find that it's actually in the diplomatic environment, it's better to go sit down with a country, sit down with an employer, sit down with a union. What are the issues? How are you addressing it? And finding resolution. What the ILO does do very well is that the ILO, as I mentioned, is a normative agency, so we create these international standards in the world of work. And as such, we have a supervisory mechanism. There are no other agencies in the UN system that have a supervisory mechanism like the ILO. When countries ratify conventions, they get deposited in an office. The ILO has an active review of this. Countries that sign international conventions have an obligation to report their progress on achieving those goals. The US doesn't sign a lot of conventions. That's another discussion for another day. But if you go to the ILO's website, there is a two-part compendium of countries that have ratified conventions and how they are realizing the provisions of those conventions. Where there's egregious problems, for example, Venezuela. It was a complaint brought by the employers against the Venezuelan government because when they nationalized the industry, they confiscated the products, the machines, and the buildings. Now, you either have to compensate them or give it back to the companies. So the companies were able to bring a charge against the government of Venezuela, and we worked with the government to improve that situation. It happened with asbestos. There's a town in Canada called Asbestos, and that's where it came from, so I'm told. But in the early days, asbestos was this miracle product. It was fire resistant, it was great. Then we realized that it has carcinogenic problems. And then a whole town's economy was built around asbestos. How do you transition out of that? Right? So all of these things are really complicated, and it doesn't happen overnight. So I would encourage you to go to our website. It is under looking at the application of standards. We have a committee that looks at this, which are not ILO officials. These are international jurists and lawyers that are recognized around the world who are sitting on the committee reviewing these issues and seeing if the response from the government meets their, what I would call maybe the sniff test. Does it sound like it's working? Have we seen it working? Do we have evidence that it's working? So we do hold countries' feet to the fire. Countries, employers and workers in those countries as well. But we don't name and shame them.
So I think,
Use the character.
sorry, I think we have time for one more question I really want to get to. Basically, the question came in when you were talking about your work in Uzbekistan. It seems workers always lose in this. If we allow companies to do whatever they want without punishment, workers lose. If we don't allow it and cut companies out, workers also lose. Thoughts on this?
Yeah, it's always the small people who suffer the downside. I mean, there's no doubt about it. I mean, it doesn't help if you close down an economy, people lose their jobs. It doesn't help you close down a factory, people lose their jobs. So governments and workers and employers have to work together. You have to create that opportunity for dialogue, right? This is so important. I mentioned earlier just about the people in Covington in Kentucky where they didn't speak to each other. I mean, communicating with one another, understanding the problems, knowing that we have concerns, common concerns, mutual concerns on this is very important. So the ILO right now is working very closely with the US government on an initiative called Empower. It was launched at the Summit for Democracy, where our Director General had spoken, and it really is about worker voice and agency. And we use the word agency because that's the enabling right. Many companies will say, well, we have a suggestion box, we have a hotline, of course the workers have a voice. But that is a disempowering situation. It doesn't change the situation in the factory. We know that women are paid less than men. 76 cents on the dollar here in the US. In many parts of the world, it's 50 cents on the dollar, 20 cents on the dollar, if the woman can actually work in the workplace. So the idea about ensuring that workers have a voice and that they are protected in the workplace is absolutely central to the ILO's mandate. So that's what I was saying, that we have 5 fundamental rights. You know, it's about the abrogation of rights. Child labor, that should not happen. Forced labor, that should not happen. Discrimination should not happen. You know, bad occupational and safety and health should not happen in the workplace. But the one positive is the freedom of association and collective bargaining. That is the enabling right. And as I said, businesses enjoy that through, you know, chambers of commerce and professional institutions and associations, as they should. They should, you know, talk to others about improving it. But you need someone to take the side of the worker, because the worker is a lonely voice in the wilderness. And when you have strong rights in the workplace for people, people are more productive, people are more loyal, people will stay longer in the company, they'll be your best advocate. So for HR managers out there, looking after your worker as the most valuable natural resource that you have is imperative. Because hiring one person costs 18 months of a salary. You talk to an HR director, they're constantly looking for talent pipelines. So why let good people walk out the door? During COVID-19, I'll give you an example. In Germany, they have a system of hour banking, which meant that if companies were going down in manufacturing and people were losing their jobs, people put in 2 hours or 3 hours or 4 hours that people can tap into and remain employed by the company. In the United States, in order to get unemployment insurance, you have to be fired. It's a bit of a perverse incentive. And then you have to rehire workers. A whole new workforce, retooling that workforce, understanding the cultural custom, or the culture of that organization. So I do think that, you know, seeing the workers as an ally is something that we like enlightened businesses to see, because it is a part of the SDGs, it is a part of ESG. So we are moving in that direction. But, you know, people don't see it. And I will leave it to say that if you had, and I'm not attacking executive compensation, although sometimes it's a bit excessive because it's based upon quarterly reporting, but if a CEO gets $20 million for performance pay, what happens if the CEO got $10 million? Because they didn't do it on their own. It was the workers in the company that had that going concern that made sure that those products were at the highest level. And if you split $10 million amongst a workforce of 10,000, I mean, that changes people's lives. They're able to pay for the school, they're able to do an extra mortgage payment, they'll go on a holiday for themselves, they may buy a car, they may even buy a house for the first time in their life. So sharing the wealth, sharing the wealth that they have helped generate, what we call shared prosperity, people, planet, and prosperity. We're in it together. And just because you can't buy the 365-foot yacht and you only have a 200-foot yacht, I think that's okay. But again, no disrespect to those who work very hard in management. I think it's very important.
Not a question, but just a comment. In the private equity industry, that is one place where ESG is used universally across the board. Whoever was asking, you know, how much people are used.
Right.
That is where, you know, they don't, private equity or venture capital firms don't get money from their investors today unless they comply with ESG criteria. And so the problem though is where no one knows how to measure it still. You're still trying to figure out, and I would think you come up with ways to measure that, but
we do have ways, but I'm glad to hear that access to capital markets is dependent upon how the performance of the company against certain measurable criteria. I think that's exactly what we're talking about here today. I'm glad to see that it's happening in the financial markets because, you know, as the enforcement officer for CBP recently said, if you hit them in the pocketbooks, they tend to take notice. Now, we don't want it to come to that, but it is true. And companies always need business for expansion, for investments in new machinery. And the other side of the coin, which we haven't talked about here, is skilling the workforce for the future. Lifelong learning, right? Who pays for that? Who's going to be investing in that? Because a company in the future, they're going to be knowledge companies. We are an innovation economy in the US. We're going to need workers who are smarter, who have technical skills, who are credentialed in certain areas. And if you align that, you know, you have access to capital and you can grow only if you follow these, you know, prescriptive steps and metrics. I think it's fantastic. It's in the benefit of the company and it weeds out the bad companies.
Well, Kevin, thank you very much for bringing your ideas and your insights to New Hampshire. It's certainly, it's been wonderful for us, and I really love that the World Affairs Council brings this collaborative opportunity for us so that we can kind of learn and grow with the ideas that you bring. So we are thrilled that you're here, and hope everyone will stay and ask a few questions after the end as well. So, and thank you all for joining us.